Top 10 myths about capitalism. Stick with me and I'll explain what people don't understand about capitalism. People who support capitalism can rightfully boast of why capitalism is responsible for much of our innovation today, and that's all thanks to the capital that's readily made available, such as the tools, the machinery, and everything that goes into the means of production in order to innovate such things. One of the most innovative time periods in our history was the Industrial Revolution. Britain was able to innovate so much, and even in the United States of America. For certain things that have been invented by government, you could claim such things like the internet. Even the market took over with the World Wide Web and made it efficient. It was not efficient under government through the intranet. Another thing to note is the very fact, in pointing to this economic calculation problem again, the government doesn't know the best interests of the people, and therefore when it comes to innovation, it's all well saying it can innovate. Does it know the best interests of the people's needs and wants? The fact is, it doesn't. The market does. The market knows where to fill the gap. It knows what people's needs and wants are. It knows what to innovate more of, and therefore it can advance technology. This is the reason why when you saw British Rail, it had outdated trains. It didn't hold the information in order to improve the technology. And if you take a look at, for example, the cars in Cuba, Cuba is decades behind other countries, and again, that is all because of the economic calculation problem. And yes, the market has innovated most things that we see today, and capital, thanks to capitalism, is responsible for all of that. Another common myth we hear is that capitalism would leave us working endless hours for such little pay. The fact is, during the Industrial Revolution, we saw a real wage earning growth rate between 1780 to 1820 in Great Britain. The real wage earning growth rate was growing by 0.55% per year, and again between 1820 to 1850 we saw a real wage earning growth rate of 1.2% per year. Now the reason why it was slower between 1780 to 1820 was simply because of government's interference, not just levying the taxes on windows and the Corn Laws, but also due to government's interference with all the war intervention that lasted from 1756 right up to 1815. And even when you look at the United States of America, they had a real wage earning growth rate of 1.6% per year. You also saw the working hours being reduced from what was initially in the 1780s. They would work more than 80 hours per week. They are now working around 34 to about 40 hours per week, and that is all thanks to people now having the luxury to go on holiday because of machines that have been able to cut down our working hours. Back in the days before the Industrial Revolution, people had to work by hands. It's thanks to the inventions of things such as the washing machine, dishwashers, and so many other great machines that have came to fruition. Those things have greatly reduced our working hours and has enabled people to live better standards of living where they have more free time in their hands, even for entertainment. It's a common myth that we hear that capitalism creates this wider gap between the rich and poor. Yet there was Hong Kong prior to 1997. They closed the wealth gap between the rich and poor, proven by the Gini coefficient, for a period of time, and of course it wasn't until government's interference that led to the wider gap. And even if you look at the Industrial Revolution time period, then if you measure between 1650 to 1700 and of course 1850 into the Second Industrial Revolution, you can see the clear difference. In 1850 the rich got richer and poor got richer. One of the most pervasive myths is that capitalism is corporatism or is the early stages of corporatism. A capitalist system rewards success and punishes failure. That's the complete opposite of corporatism that rewards failure and punishes success. Through the corporatist system, big corporations lobby the government for more government regulation to stamp out the competition of smaller businesses. It does this in order to gain monopolies. The smaller businesses cannot afford the strong government regulation, whereas the big corporations can, as they can pay people to find loopholes in the strong government regulation. So corporatism is all about seeking to destroy competition, whereas capitalism welcomes fierce competition in the marketplace and consumer choice. Corporatism does not welcome deregulation, because that is what opens up fierce competition and consumer choice. It's via the strong government regulation that destroys this competition, as well as limits consumer consumer choice and innovation that leads to the very problems that we see today with this monopolistic system. Love the message of liberty and would like to learn more? Be sure to check out some of my other videos and don't forget to subscribe. Another myth that we hear is that capitalism was responsible for the Great Depression. Rather, that was the fault of the intervention from the Federal Reserve, who were manipulating interest rates, changing reserve ratios and printing fiat currency out of thin air. Now, when we talk about capitalism, we're talking about the free market, and you cannot have a free market without the free market determining freely what the interest rates are. So interest rates are determined freely in the marketplace by the laws of supply and demand, as is the ratio of money as well as free market money. Free market money meaning money determined by the people. The fiat monetary system was not determined by the people, whereas the gold and silver standard were. I hear this myth quite often, is that capitalism is inefficient and therefore we need government. The fact of the matter is capitalism is efficient and it's driven by consumer demand. It's this common myth that the idea that capitalism is pro-business and therefore businesses can set their own prices, produce whatever the hell they like, and consumers will just have to go along with it. It's also predicated around the idea of a capitalist system being based around monopolies, as if to say consumers don't have choice, there isn't competition, and basically ignoring the fact fierce competition exists as well as consumer choice. Therefore, it's the consumers who determine what gets produced, even how much gets produced, and they do this through freely walking into stores, buying goods, and businesses can therefore see what their profits and losses are, and they can determine through price signals what needs produced more of, how much needs produced more of, as well of course where to allocate scarce natural resources and what to invest more in. If it wasn't for the consumers freely determining by buying their goods, they would not know this information, and there would be no point in businesses producing whatever the hell they like just for the sake of it, because what would be the point? Consumers are not robots, they're not forced into buying goods. Therefore, economic reality tells us when price is set, it's set by what people are willing to pay for it, not by what a business is going to set. Just because a business sets a price does not mean to say the consumer is going to value that product at that price, and therefore the capitalist system is efficient because it can determine what needs produced more of, where to allocate the scarce resources and where not to. What consumers are not spending on is telling them their losses, and what consumers are spending most on is telling them their profits. Therefore, there is economic efficiency. Whereas when we talk about government central planning, it leads to the exact opposite of this. Thanks to government central planning and government price controls, you lead to a distortion of the information of profits and losses, and therefore it leads to the misallocation of valuable scarce resources. And I don't know how many times we've seen this happen, where you see shortages as well as waste occur thanks to government's own price controls and of course government providence, whether you talk about healthcare or anything else in the marketplace. So another common myth that we hear is that capitalism was responsible for the banking crisis. There are no such thing as bailouts under a capitalist system. When you face losses under a capitalist system, you are facing liquidation. This system that we live under today is corporatism. As a result of the government interference, the socialist government protectionism that protects the bad banks from failing, that enabled them to get away with illegally protected fraud that they had, and this is why the bad banks became too big to fail, which led on to the banking crisis in the first place. In a capitalist system, the bad banks would have faced failure, the taxpayer wouldn't even have paid a penny, and all that would have happened is the assets of the bad banks would have been sold off to more efficient competitors, and things would have continued on as they were. The only difference, the bad banks would have faced liquidation, and that's it. Another thing we hear often enough is that capitalism is blamed for monopolies. Standard Oil never held a monopoly, the De Beers Group only happened because of government's nationalisation, and anytime we see a monopoly in the marketplace, it always stems from government's interference in the marketplace.
It's a system failure at a federal, a state, and a local level.
And this is not a free market. You ask people to show you where a monopoly had formed under a capitalist system, and anytime they show you, if they even point to Hong Kong, They are pointing to an economy that is no longer a free market, a system with which government has created oligopolies, the likes of why Microsoft gained such a monopoly, and it's simply because of the fact that we live under corporatism. It's thanks to consumer choice, as well of course fierce competition in the marketplace, that prevents those monopolies from forming. One of the funniest myths I've heard is this idea that capitalism is not just pro-business but is pro-consumerism, and therefore businesses can produce whatever the hell they like and just sell it out there in the market with false advertising, and the consumer is exploited. They'll just buy the goods and they are bought into this whole consumerist market through this false advertising. What they completely ignore is the very fact that it's thanks to capitalism and fierce competition, as well as business reputation, that forced businesses to put into place their returns services. Therefore, in the real world of the economy, businesses can produce goods all they want, but it's down to the consumer whether they're willing to pay for it or not. And if consumers don't get what they want, they'll go elsewhere to their competition. Even if you use the scenario as if to say there is no return service in the business, what are they going to do then? Well, they just won't shop there again. There is this obsession to try and blame capitalism for mass murder, whether it's due to the point of a gun or even starvation. The fact is, when we talk about imperialism, colonialism, fascism, theocracy, or even feudalism, you're talking about collectivism. Collectivism is a word synonymous to the word socialism, even by definition. When we talk about capitalism, it is the only individualist system that has ever existed. It is the opposite of collectivism, even in their desperate attempt to turn to Augusto Pinochet. Augusto Pinochet, yes, he was advised to turn towards the free market. However, his transition, when he started out, he did kill 3,000 people, which no one would ever agree with, but this was not the fault of the free market. A free market means the power is in the hands and control of the people, whereas the 3,000 killings was taking place during a time when there was a transition. When you look at things such as the starvation takes place because of collectivism, such as the centralisation of agriculture, as we saw in the 20th century alone. You only have to turn your attention to the Soviet Union, who centralised agriculture, as well of course China in the Great Leap Forward that led more than 70 million people alone in those two regimes to their death due to starvation.